Again, turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 12. That's in your New Testament. And we are in a series as we're looking at this incredible season that God has us in as a church. We are in the biggest season ever for us as a church. And I don't mean that what God has done in past seasons is less important or less great. It's just with how God works, every season that he calls us into is the next great season. God is doing cool things in our lives, cool things in our church, and it's an incredible season. As we look forward to moving into our new facility in about a year and a half, we'll start construction in July. And so where we are now as a church is we're trying to raise funds, and we're going to next week there will be Commitment Sunday, and we'll take pledges toward this, and so it's exciting. And what we're looking at in this incredible calling that we have and this task that's so large in front of us is that we're looking at how God is using this and this calling to impact our city. So a couple weeks ago, we were looking at this vision that God has given us as a church to impact our city. So this calling is great. It's bigger than ourselves. It's even bigger than this generation. We believe it's going to impact this city and the surrounding neighborhoods for many years to come, many generations to come. But then last week we looked at the idea that this calling is also for us individually, that our part matters. The roles that we play individually matters in this calling. But what I want to look at today is what I believe is that God wants to change something in us, in our church. So today is really as me as a pastor speaking to our church, our people. So if you're a guest, I'm so glad you're here, but understand I'm speaking directly to our people. God has called us to do something because he wants to change us from the inside out. Because what we're going to look at today is a very important principle. It's something that impacts all of our lives. Because every single one of us has embraced a way of thinking and living that is actually founded on a lie. But the reason we embrace it is all of our culture embraces it. It's something until we discover the truth, we will always fall into a pattern that really is really a pattern of deceit. And what I mean by that is it will impact the way that we think. It will impact the desires that we set and the goals that we set for our lives. It will impact how we spend our money. It will impact us in our relationships. And it's all founded on a lie. And so what I want to do today is I want to look at this principle and then look at the truth that God gives us, because I really do believe that God wants to change us in such a way that it actually changes the very nature of our church and the culture of our church, so that not only in the next season will we be prepared to live out our calling, but we'll be prepared for even greater things. And so let me just dive right in and tell you what the behavior is that all of us embrace unless we've learned otherwise. And that is this: people spend their lives accumulating more stuff than they need. How many of you would say amen? Amen, right? I mean, I don't really have to convince you of this. This is a pattern of our lives. We buy, we accumulate stuff. And for some of you, you look at that and go, is that wrong? And in some ways it's not. In other ways it can be, and that's what we'll look at today. But what we see in our culture is that we just naturally get into a rhythm where we continue to accumulate more and more stuff in our lives. And what's fascinating is even the standard of need continues to elevate in our culture. I mean, you go back just a few generations ago, and most families, if they had one car, that would be enough. And now families have 2, 3, however many kids are driving. You have that many cars. And we look back at the sizes of houses. And many generations ago, houses were much smaller. Now they're getting larger. And I remember when I came first from Detroit to Lancaster, and Mary and I were trying to find a house, I was fascinated by all the old homes that we would go in, how small their closets were. And just because the only house that we ever owned had larger closets in Detroit. And so we came here and their closets were tiny. And I remember thinking, like, how could they possibly fit all their clothes in there? And then I realized, oh, they did fit all of their clothes in there. They just had much less clothes. Now we need double closets and walk-in closets because we don't just have a couple of shirts, a couple pair of pants. We have whole wardrobes and we have seasonal clothes. And this is what our culture is now. Can you guys even remember? Now, this is take you back, but can you remember just a few generations ago, or maybe I would say even 10 years ago, not even generations, 10 years ago, where you would call someone's house and leave a message on voicemail, and it was okay if they didn't call you back for a day or two? Do you guys remember that? Now it's like if you text someone or you call someone and they don't respond within an hour, you just assume they're dead, right? You're like, what's going on? Like you're trying to frantically get a hold of them and you're texting them, and because you're like, you have to respond immediately. I've actually had that. I've had people run into me in public and they're like, hey, I texted you a few hours ago. You didn't respond. And I'm like, well, you asked me a question. I haven't found the answer yet. They're like, well, could have told me that you were at least looking for the answer. You're like, sorry, didn't know the rules, But this is our culture, is that it used to be not a need to have instant communication with someone. Now it is. And so the needs keep changing. So what happens in our lives is we keep in this process trying to accumulate more and more stuff, more than we'll ever need in our lives. But why is this potentially a problem? Well, this pattern of behavior starts to shape the way that we think, and then the way that we think impacts the remainder of our behaviors. And what it forces us into is a way of thinking that is this. And I'm going to put 3 truths up on the screen and just let you kind of think about this, and I'm going to illustrate it. But this mindset that we embrace is that life equals stuff. Life equals stuff. And when I say life, I'm talking more than just physical existence. I'm talking about the quality of existence. That in our lives that we want to be happy, so we want to experience joy, we want to have the contentment, we want to feel like we're experiencing life at its best and its fullest. And in our way of thinking, unless we have learned otherwise, we naturally fall into this pattern that we think life equals stuff. So if I have a lot of stuff, then I'm really living life large and I'm really happy. And we'll even look at the success of our lives and how we determine it based on how much we have. But it's not just simply life equals stuff. There's another level to it. And that is the value of life is proportional to the value of stuff. So it's not just accumulating random things. It's that we want to accumulate valuable things in our lives. But then another part of this one is then the value of stuff is determined by comparison to other people's stuff. You guys know what I'm talking about? So in your life, you want stuff because you think that's what life is. That's how you determine if you're successful. But then when you look at it, you think it's not just stuff in general. It has to be valuable. But the way you determine if it's valuable is you compare it typically to the people closest to you. So you might be happy with your house if it's comparable to all your friends' houses. If everyone else buys a bigger house or a different house, then all of a sudden you start to measure your house differently. You see it, your friends start dressing a certain way, you start dressing a certain way. Your friends lose a bunch of weight, then there's pressure on you to lose weight. There's this rhythm of life that we're constantly comparing ourselves to those that are around us, and then that determines if we are successful in our lives. And so what I want to do is I'm going to leave this on the screen, but I want you to think about these truths, and then I want to illustrate it another way. So for the illustration, this box represents our life, and each one of us has a box. And a natural rhythm for us in our lives is we think, because we believe this idea that life equals stuff, is that our goal is to fill our lives or fill our boxes with as much stuff as we possibly can. So this becomes the rhythm of our lives, is that we got to accumulate more and more stuff. And so in our minds, we oftentimes have this passion or desire or the question, what does a good life look like? What do I need in my life in order to be successful and truly satisfied? And so we try to start putting stuff in there. And a lot of times we'll begin with relationships. And so we'll have those as a kid. You want good friendships, and then that turns into you want romantic relationships. You want a boyfriend, you want a girlfriend. Most people eventually want a husband and a wife. And so we pursue after this, and we think, in order to have life and be happy and be successful, I need relationships as a part of it. And then we go and we figure out we need some other stuff, like we want success. So we want to find some recognition for being successful in our jobs and with the talents that we have in our lives, and we want other people to know. And so we strive after that, and most people desire to have some type of home, and so we have a house, and then we want that, and maybe it's an apartment, and then a lot of times you'll start off with a starter home, and in your mind you think, this isn't where I'm going to live forever. I'm going to build up some wealth, and then we're going to sell it, and I'm going to get bigger, and so I need that in order to be successful, and then we just need other things in our lives, like we need cars, and so we have cars in our lives and vehicles because everyone has cars, and we need newer cars. And then we might have hobbies. You see it? And this actually covers 2 hobbies. One, it can represent hunting, or it can represent crafting because it's a papier-mâché deer head. Why would anyone have this, you ask? I have no idea, okay? It actually comes with a hook that you can hang it on your wall if you want to. Classy. Comes in many different colors. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so this represents just the hobbies of your life, whatever they might be, because you need those to be happy. And then you just need other stuff, okay? And so in our lives, we want toys. And so we want clothes, and we want motorcycles, and we might want some freedoms of life. I know when you're a teenager, you long for freedoms, and as you become an adult, you still want more freedoms, and you want financial freedom, and you want authority, and you want influence, and so you pursue these things. And so in our lives, we keep trying to accumulate more and more stuff. And then, obviously we want money. We want wealth. Well, let's be honest, we want money, right? We don't want the small amount, we want large amount of money. And so we keep pursuing resources in our lives. And so we want our relationships, and we want everything that we can desire of our hearts. We want to go after, and we want to accomplish it. But then when we feel it, here's the question is this really what life is about? See, for most of us, we go after and we say, this determines if we're happy. This determines if we feel like we're experiencing life at its fullest, is if I can accumulate more and more stuff. And so we have boats and we have other things in there, and we just have all that life has to offer. And for some of you, maybe you would go, man, I don't know if I determine life that way. But let me just push back and ask a couple of questions and see if it registers with you. What happens if you desire something and you're going after it and you really want it in your heart and you don't get it? So you want that relationship and it just never works out. The person doesn't love you the same way. Or what happens if you go after that job and you're pursuing it and you feel like you're qualified and you know it will change the financial situation in your home and you just are really desperate for it, then you don't get it? Or what happens if you have just something else that your heart goes after and longs after? Maybe it's a connection or it's a reconciliation, whatever it might be, and then you don't get it. Does that impact the quality of your life? It does. Does that impact how you view yourself and the success of your lives? It does. Or what happens if you do have something and you've grown accustomed to it and then you lose it? So you do have the job and then you lose the job. You do have a relationship and then you break up. You do have the finances and then the economy suffers and you lose that. Does that impact the quality of your life? It does. Or what happens if you have something and you get it and you're excited about it, you purchase it and you're like, man, look what I got. And then you find out your friend got one too, but theirs is a little bit different. Yours is, oh. And all of a sudden your friend has something that you now wanted and now theirs is bigger and better than yours. Does that impact your life? It does. And so what happens in our lives is we start to get frustrated, and even though we don't want to admit it, the reality is this is how we shape our view of our life. If I have stuff, if I have possessions, if it's at its fullest, then I'm successful, and therefore I will be happy. But what's the problem with this? Well, there's many problems. One of the big problems is there's just simply not enough stuff to truly satisfy us in our lives. Because each one of us, as we go through the rhythm of life and we start to pursue and we start to attain things, here's the rhythm that almost all of us go through. You get a new item, and for a season, you're happy. You're excited. It brings joy to your life. But eventually, whatever that new is becomes the norm, and then you get used to it. So you buy that house, and you're excited for a season. And then it just becomes your house, and then it's normal to you. You buy that car, and you're excited for a season. But then it just becomes normal to you. You get the raise at work, and all of a sudden you have more money than you've ever had in your life until you just get simply used to spending that money, and it becomes the norm for your life. And so what happens is it forces us to constantly go after new things over and over because we want that high. We want that emotional high that comes from getting more stuff, and so we run after it, and it's never enough to truly satisfy us. Or in our lives we think, oh, I'm successful, but then we start to look around on the people around us, and we can always find people who have more than us. And a lot of the ways that we determine the success of our lives and the wealth of our lives is in comparison. And so you find people that have more than you. And even if you don't find one person who has more than you in every single area, what we naturally do is we find the one person in the one area who has more than us. So you find the person with the nicer house, you find the person with the better marriage, you find the person with the better looking looks and body, and you find the person that's more talented, and we compare ourselves and we start to not feel as successful in our lives because, again, our value and our worth is shaped on this. Or we lose stuff. We put our hope in this, and then these items that we really have no authority on, no power to control, we start to lose them, and it starts to devastate us. And then what happens in all of our lives, potentially, if we go unchecked, is that at one point, we start to get into the posture that we have to get. We get. I mean, this is how we live our lives, our entire lives. I need more and more. But at some point, the drive to get turns into the drive to keep. At some point, we just realize, I have to now get more and more stuff, but I also have to protect my stuff. And the posture we start to take is that I can't allow anyone else to take this. And we start to have the fear, and we start to have the stress. And even though, realistically, we don't have the power to protect our stuff, we still have the stress of it. We still have the worry, and we try our best. And so we're still trying to accumulate more and more in our lives, and at the same time defend this. And this is the posture that we have in our lives. Stuff is life, and this is my value, and this determines if I'm successful, and this determines if I'm happy, and we become so stressed out. And so here's the question. Do you think this is what Jesus had in mind for our lives? Do you think this is the posture when Jesus said, I have come that you might have life and have it at its fullest, that he meant more stuff, that your life would be full of stuff? He didn't. But yet this is what our culture tells us. And if we're not careful, all of us get into this same pattern. Let me just ask a really blunt, direct question. How many of you have found yourself at some point in your life in this pattern? You just go after stuff, go after stuff. But Jesus, thankfully, had something better in mind for us. And this is what he addresses in Luke chapter 12. So if you haven't, please turn there. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus, and we're going to pick up at verse 15, but in verse 13, a man comes to Jesus and he says, Master, can you tell my brother to divide the inheritance? And we don't really know any context from it. So we don't know if the brother was being unethical or if this brother just wanted his share. And because the oldest brother would typically get 2 portions and then every other sibling would get 1 portion. And so we don't know if he was saying we want him to divide it equally. Whatever it is, he asked Jesus to interact in this situation. And Jesus responds and says, that's not my role. I'm not the judge. I'm not an arbitrator between you two. And so he says, that's not my role. But Jesus senses something in this man's heart and uses it as an opportunity to teach. And what Jesus senses is this man was concerned about stuff, that this was the posture he was taking. He was worried that he wasn't getting his fair share, was concerned that he wouldn't get the value of life that he was aiming at. And so Jesus addresses it. And in verse 15, he says a very powerful truth. Jesus said to them, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So here's what Jesus says to him, and I highlighted a few of the words because they're so powerful and relevant to what we're discussing today. Jesus says to them, take care and be on your guard, so fight against this or be prepared to go against this, against all covetousness. And what covetousness is greediness. It is the image of a person who is focused on stuff. A person who wants more in their lives. They're coveting, they're looking at other people's stuff, and they're also trying to protect their own. And this is their source of hope. This is the lifestyle that they're living. And Jesus says, be careful. Don't take that posture. And then he proclaims a truth that is relevant for all generations. He says, for one's life does not consist, and consist in the Greek means equal to. So what he says is one's life does not equal the abundance of his possessions. So Jesus says the very truth that we're dealing with today. I'll put it in really everyday modern language. Jesus says to them, life does not equal stuff. Life does not consist or does not equal stuff. And what's fascinating about this is part of me as a teacher would think our culture, the reason we're this way is because we're a consumeristic culture. But what we see is that Jesus was addressing this exact same thing 2,000 years ago. This is something that every generation in history has battled with, that they think their value and their worth is found in stuff. And Jesus says to them 2,000 years ago, be careful. Don't take that posture because it's not true. Your value of life and what matters is not how much you can accumulate, the abundance of your possessions. And so from this point forward, Jesus is going to address this issue with them, and he's going to give them a parable or a story with a lesson to try to illustrate to them what true life is about. If it's not stuff, he wants to communicate what real life is about. And so he picks up in verse 16. And he says, and Jesus told them a parable. Again, that's a story with a lesson. So he's making this up. He says, the land of a rich man produced plentiful. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, I just love that he speaks to himself, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. So Jesus is making up this story. And he says, here's this guy who's wealthy. And so logically speaking, if he's wealthy, he already has large barns because that's determining his wealth. And this guy already has more than enough that he needs. I mean, this is the context of what Jesus is giving. He says, this wealthy man with large barns has an incredible crop, probably the best crop in his life. He's unprepared for it because it's just so good. And so his response is, okay, I have more than I need right now. I'm going to tear down my current barns and build larger ones, and then I can just live life easy, and I'll be happy because this guy's perspective is obviously what Jesus is trying to address. This guy's life is, or his perspective is, lots of stuff, good life. This is what it's all about. I'm going to accumulate more stuff, and then I'm just going to relax and be happy, and this is what life is about. And so Jesus tells us, now let's be honest. If we were to stop the story there and you didn't know at all what the context of today's message was about, we would look at that and go, yeah, makes sense, right? Wouldn't we all just go, you have a good crop, you build bigger barns. Duh, right? Everyone would think that way because we do the same thing. This is the rhythm of our lives. You make a certain amount of money, you get a raise, you spend more money. You raise your lifestyle to whatever it is that you make. You get a bonus, you raise your lifestyle. This is a natural progression of our lives. When you get more money, now you start to buy the desires of your heart. So you want something, you're desiring it, all of a sudden you get more money, you go and buy it. This is logical. This is a natural rhythm. And so we pursue this rhythm of life. I have more money, I get more stuff. And if life is about stuff, that's a great strategy. But Jesus is about to switch it. And he's about to give them a different perspective, something that they're not considering. And in verse 20, he says, "But God said to him," the wealthy man, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" So all of a sudden, there's this shift in this story that this man thinks, okay, I'm good. I have my stuff. And then Jesus says, but this man dies that day. So that night, his soul is demanded of him. It's this imagery that he has lost his physical life, and now he's going to stand before God. And it's actually the imagery of judgment. His soul is demanded. God's going to judge him. And then God poses this question to him. He says, you have spent your entire life accumulating stuff. You have larger barns, more stuff. Your life is full. And then the question God poses to this man is, okay, whose stuff is that now? Who does that belong to now? And we don't answer it. There's no answer in there. Could be a sibling, could be a child, but here's what we clearly know. The man no longer owns this stuff. It will be spent by another generation. It's no longer his. And all of a sudden, Jesus is introducing that the investment of this man's life was for nothing. It has no value. It's not going to help him now. It's not even giving him true life. Because remember, the context of this story is Jesus trying to reveal what true life is, and all of a sudden, he has nothing. And then Jesus introduces another way of thinking, that there's really two ways that we can invest and two types of life that we can invest in. Verse 21, he says, so is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich toward God. Now, here's what I love about this verse. Jesus is not at all attacking wealth. Jesus is not anti-wealth. He's not anti-wealthy people. You can't find the poverty gospel supported in Scripture. But what Jesus is clearly saying is there are two possibilities of investment. There's an investment of your own physical life, and this can become the focus of how you spend your money. And then there's also a spiritual investment. There's an investment of how we invest our resources and our hearts and our lives with Jesus. And the context of this individual, this rich man, was that he chose to put all of his resources into the physical without making any investment in the spiritual. And so what looked like on the surface a man of incredible wealth, what we learn is he is a man of incredible poverty, because he had a misappropriation of funds. He put what God wanted in something else into the spiritual realm, simply into the physical, put all his eggs in one basket, and then his life was demanded. And what's communicated in this parable is that he was ill-prepared for the future. He was ill-prepared for judgment, and therefore he was going to miss out on the true life that was offered by Jesus. And this is a powerful moment, because what Jesus is doing now is he's trying to get us to understand this principle. The perspective of two boxes, the perspective of two lives, that how we invest matters, that all of us have the option of investing in the physical, but we also at the same time have the option of investing in the spiritual. And how we invest matters. It matters for our contentment here on this earth, but it also matters for eternity. And this is what he's communicating. See, Jesus says it another way. When Jesus was challenging people to come and to follow him, in Matthew 16, he said it this way. He said, then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. See, here's the rhythm of a relationship with Jesus. Jesus says, you can come after me. I want you to follow me. If you have faith, come after me. And this is how we enter into a relationship with Jesus. We put our faith in him. We trust in him. This is how we experience salvation. But Jesus doesn't want us to be naive. He doesn't want us to misunderstand what he's actually demanding. He's saying, if you want to come after me, you have to be willing to surrender your life. You have to be willing to deny your own wants and your own desires if he calls you to do so. And this is the challenge that he gives us is you can come after me, you can experience salvation, but there's going to be an expectation of how you spend your resources. And then he paints the picture of between a physical life and a spiritual life. He says it this way. He says, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And it's a play on words. What Jesus is saying is, some of you will actually experience the fullness of what the physical life has to offer. You will have the houses. You will have the bank accounts. You will have the toys. You will have the resources. You will have the popularity, the clothes, the looks. You can have everything that this world has to offer. He says some of you will save your life. You think, oh, I got it. I'm happy and I'm content. And there's some of you that can absolutely be here right now 100% content because you have all that this world has to offer. But he says, but that person actually loses life. That person is just like the rich fool whose life is demanded, and all of a sudden he finds out at the worst possible time how ill-prepared he was for eternity. He says, but then there are others, and other people will think that they're losing their life because they're not going to have the same things. They're going to surrender these things, and God's going to call them to different levels of trust, and they'll still have possessions. He's not calling every single person to poverty. But what he's calling them to is a surrender. It's a denial of self. It's the taking up of the cross, which means you're dying to your own wants and your own desires. And he says, and you will live a physical life feeling like I'm living life at less than what everyone else is. You'll look at the prosperity of people around you and even the prosperity of the wicked, and it will be a temptation for you. It will be a thorn in your flesh, and you'll struggle with it, and you'll be frustrated. And he says, you're going to feel like you've lost your life. I mean, this is the imagery. He doesn't say you're floating on a cloud. He says you're struggling. You feel like you're dying to yourself. He says, but actually what you get in return is real life. What you're getting is actually Jesus. And this is his challenge to us, to understand this. A relationship with Jesus, it's founded in faith, but it grows through surrender. And this is a rhythm that so many Christians miss out on because we look at how are we saved? Well, we're saved by faith. There's no question. Scripture is clear on that. Ephesians 2:8, we are saved through grace, or by grace through faith, so it's not by works so anyone can boast. But it says that we are saved by faith. We enter into a relationship with Jesus by faith. We experience salvation. It's the get out of hell card, okay? But many Christians stop there. And they think that's all that Jesus has to offer is salvation. But it's so much deeper. What Jesus is actually calling us into is a life of surrender so that we can experience what a true relationship with him is. And so what happens in our lives is we have all of our stuff, and then we want to put Jesus in. And we get saved, and we think, okay, I want Jesus, but here's the problem. Jesus can't be Lord of our lives and second in the areas that are important to us. Jesus can't be Lord of our finances and yet second in our finances. He can't be Lord of our relationships and yet second in our relationships. He can't be Lord of our time and yet second in our time. And so we try to cram him in there. But this isn't the rhythm of what he's calling us to. And when our culture tells us that this is what life looks like, we go after, we run after it, and then we find ourselves, even as Christians, frustrated. We even at times look at Jesus and we think, I'm not sure your word is true. I'm not sure what you say in your word is actual because I don't feel joy. I don't feel peace in my heart. I'm completely stressed out. I'm frustrated. I don't feel like I'm living life at its fullest. And for some of us, we even long for eternity thinking that's the only time I'll be happy is in eternity. And Jesus is saying right now, he wants to be Lord of our lives so that we can experience true life. But how does it happen? It happens in a process of surrendering our stuff to Jesus. And I want to give you some good news. It doesn't mean that we have to get rid of everything. That's not what Jesus calls us to. But what he calls us to is to surrender everything. So what that looks like is that we take time in our lives, and many of us have never done this in every area. But we take time in the important areas of our lives, all of our resources, all that we want and all that we desire. And we go before Jesus and we say, I'm going to give that to you. I'm going to surrender that to you. And so we're in times of prayer and we say, Jesus, this represents my resources. So this represents all of my finances. I give that to you. You tell me how you want me to spend it. If you want me to be generous in this season, I'll be generous. If you want me to be conservative in this season, I'll be conservative. I'll prepare. But I will honor you. I will put you first in my finances. I will give you my tithes and my offerings. And I will embrace a culture of generosity. But all that I have is yours. And so we surrender it to Jesus. And we say, and our toys and our possessions and all that we have, well, I'm going to give that to you. If you want me to get rid of it, I'll get rid of it. But it's yours, Lord, and I surrender it to you. And the freedoms that I have, even freedoms that we have as Americans, the freedom of speech, one of our most valuable freedoms. Lord, I realize I have a right to speak it, but I don't always need to speak it. So, Lord, I'm going to give you authority over my words. I'm going to give you authority over what I speak to the people around me. I'm going to give you authority over what I post on any type of social media because I'm surrendering my freedoms to you. And, Lord, I'm going to give you my hobbies forever. You can have that one. That's yours, Lord. And, Lord, I'm going to give you any glory that I get, any success I have. I'm going to surrender that to you. It's not for me. It's for you. And I'll surrender my vehicles, and I'll surrender all the different objects I have in my life, and I'll give you my relationships. Lord, I'm single, and I want to get married, and it's tough for me in this season, and I feel alone, but I know that you have a perfect person for me. I know you have a perfect plan, so Lord, I'm going to give that to you. Or Lord, I'm married, and my marriage is awful. My spouse is difficult to live with. They've hurt me. They've wounded me. But I'm going to forgive them one more time. And I'm going to submit that relationship to you because I believe you are God over all that I have. And Lord, I'll give you my house. If you want me to keep my house, I'll keep it. If you want me to sell my house, I'll sell it. And I know people that are actually selling their house right now so that they can give more money to the building fund. They're downsizing so that they can give more to God because this is their posture. God, it's yours. But here's what's good. See, when we first hear this, we think, oh, that sounds scary. That sounds awful because we just gave everything away, all that we've spent our lives accumulating. But what's powerful in the economy of God is in this moment that we start to surrender what is of value to us, it is in that moment that we simultaneously learn to truly trust Jesus in our lives. And we go beyond just experiencing salvation, and what we experience is a relationship that we can trust in Jesus. So we experience a relationship where he now becomes our provider, and we recognize that. We go, God, the responsibility is you. You're going to take care of my provision. You're going to take care of me. I don't have to stress about that. So when we have 1 month that's a little bit lower in finances and our business doesn't do as great for a couple of months, we're like, God, it's yours. I surrendered it to you. You're in charge. If you want to take it away, that's fine. The responsibility is yours. And Lord, in my relationships, I don't have to feel like I have to figure everything out. I surrender that to you. And the same thing in my home and my cars and my resources. Lord, I give that to you. And you develop a trust relationship. And so what you get in return is your life, instead of being filled with stuff, is filled with Jesus. And Jesus fills your life. But then this is the great news, is you become satisfied in Jesus, but you actually get to enjoy your stuff more. And some of you have gotten here. You know exactly what I'm talking about. All of a sudden now, the stuff of your life, your hope's not in it. Your identity is not in it. Because your identity and your hope is in Jesus. So what that means is, while you have your stuff and Jesus allows you to keep it, you enjoy it and you have fun. That boat, yeah, that's a ton of fun. I love it. The success I have in work, that's great. I love what I'm doing. I love that job. But if Jesus says, hey, time to sell it, we go, okay, no problem. That's not my identity. That's not my hope. God says, hey, I want you to take a different job. I want you to get a new role. And you go, you know what? That's fine. My identity is not in that. And we surrender it. God tells you to downsize your house. Sure. I enjoyed it while I had it, but I'll downsize. And you know what's interesting? I know people who God has told them to buy a bigger house because of what they do and how they use their home. And God told them to buy a bigger house. And you know what? That's what God does. Sometimes he says buy. Sometimes he says sell. Sometimes he says get. Sometimes he says give in our lives. And we're okay because our identity is not found in it. And we can lose everything, surrender everything, and still be happy because we still have Jesus in our lives. But here's the truth. What I'm saying will only be theoretical to you until you surrender all of your stuff to him. Until you have that moment where you say, Jesus, I'm giving it all to you. I surrender it to you. And I'm telling you, I'm just thankful to say I've lived this out. This is the one area of my life that I just, for my entire life, for whatever reason, I've had victory in. That God has allowed me in this area to surrender my stuff to you. I've never been controlled by stuff. I don't know why, but it's just how I've been wired. And I'm thankful for it because I have the confidence that my God is going to take care of me. And it's allowed my relationship to grow so much deeper. So when God called me to leave Detroit to come here, I could do it because my hope was in Jesus, not in stuff. And when I was offered a much lesser position, it didn't matter to me because I don't care about a title. I care about Jesus. And this is what he's calling all of us to right now. He wants us to understand this truth. This powerful verse in 1 John 5:12 says, whoever has the Son has life. Whoever does not have the Son does not have life. Clearly spelled out, whoever has the Son has life. But how do you have the Son? By surrendering all to him. Because our relationship with Jesus is so much more than just salvation. It's a relationship where we trust and we surrender. And he says, if you want to come after me, surrender it all. If you want to experience the fullness of life, surrender it all. And what I will give you in exchange will be greater than anything this world has to offer. You see, once again, I want to say, and I've said this a lot over the last few weeks, Jesus isn't interested in taking. He's not wanting more and more of our stuff. He wants our hearts, and he knows our hearts are connected with our stuff. And with Jesus, you can't find one example in Scripture where God takes something just for the sake of taking. It's always for the purpose of giving more, of blessing more, because our God is an extravagantly generous God. And so what we learn is that a relationship with Jesus is really where life is. It's not in stuff, it's in a relationship. And what we learn is real wealth is not accumulating stuff, it's surrendering to God. That's true wealth. And the reason this matters is for us as a church, next week we're going to have a Sunday where God is challenging us to commit financially something larger than we've ever done in our lives. Again, if you're a guest, I'm just going to give you permission to tune out, okay? I'm going to speak directly to our church. Next Sunday, God is challenging us to raise $3 million. $3 million toward the remodel of our new facility. That's big. That's huge. I mean, it's bigger than anything God's ever asked us to do. And when we were going over the numbers and we were looking at it on paper, as the lead pastor, I looked at it on paper and I thought, no way. I got to be honest. I didn't have this moment of incredible faith. I wasn't like, watch out, seas, you're going to part. I was like, $3 million. Wow, that's a lot of money. And I prayed about it, and I thought about it, and the elders prayed about it, and we talked about it, and we realized this is what we need. This is what God is calling us to. But here's what I know is that God has provided it. It's just in our pockets. It's in our bank accounts. And the only way we're going to accomplish it is if we, as LCC, surrender some of our stuff. We surrender our bank accounts, and we surrender our future goals and desires and hopes. And we'll have to make a sacrifice. And what God's asking us is that our gift will be two things next week. That one, it will be a gift of faith, which means we're going to write down on our commitment cards a number that we know in the physical doesn't make sense. That it's going to be a challenge for us, that it's a step of faith where we're going to have to say to God, okay, God, if you want me to do this, you're going to have to do a supernatural part. You're going to have to show me how this works, and we're going to have a step of faith. But then there's a second part is it's going to be a step of sacrifice, where we realize the only way this happens is if we're willing to give up something that's of value to us. And so we might postpone a project around our house. We might postpone a vacation. We might put off buying a new car for a couple of years. And we're saying in this next 2 years, we're going to make a sacrifice because we believe that you've called us to do this. And what's going to be an amazing moment is some of you have never had this moment. You've never had the moment where you surrendered your stuff to Jesus. And this season, this calling, is the first opportunity of your life to surrender what is yours to God so that you can experience a true relationship of faith with him. And so God is giving us this season as a gift. He's not taking our money. He's not taking our resources. He's giving us an opportunity to surrender ourselves to him so that we can experience what true life is about.